Okay, so a lot has happened in the last week or so since the last live stream in the sports world. Obviously, uh, on the NRL side of things, the Brisbane Broncos still haven't named a head coach successor to Anthony Seibold, and that is interesting because there's only 2 rounds left of the regular season. They're not going to make finals. They could still yet get the wooden spoon. They haven't really decided on a new CEO. And there's a short list of 10 candidates, so that's going to be interesting to see if they announce Green, the North Queensland Cowboys coach, or Kevin Walters as the head coach. That's going to be an interesting subplot. The ECB have announced that they are cutting 20% of their budget when it comes to job positions. That's 62 people out of the organisation, and they've announced further losses. And the fact that the 100 format is guaranteed to make a loss in the first year, which will be next year if all goes well, means that's a money pit, and that's going to be even bigger losses on top of what they've already obviously sustained in the last 7 months. So what's happening at the ECB is crucial, and questions have to be asked where the TV money has gone. We know obviously that the Championship has got its second round fixtures this evening. We know that obviously the Premier League's obviously restarted as well. Players can still transfer between clubs. That's going to be interesting how that season plays out and how it's the first couple of rounds of games. So I'm not really interested in any of the results so far, who won what, who's not won what. But that's going to be interesting to see how that season plays out, considering that there's no winter break, the adjustment to the transfer window, the shortened pre-season, the changes to the FA Cup and the League Cup with no replays and all and such, no home and away legs in the League Cup. So that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. We know that obviously the Champions League and Europa League, players will have to quarantine somehow, and how that's going to play out this season as well is going to be really interesting. The fallout from Foden and Greenwood in Iceland, I think, shows weaknesses within the England setup with Gareth Southgate as coach. The question marks over his continued time in charge, obviously, of England and what's going on there. There's some rumours about fractions in the camp and a lack of firm hand there. And the players basically misbehaving, which is not a good sign for a sport that had so many negative headlines in the last 7 months with players misbehaving during lockdown. That's again another negative headline. Grealish signing a new contract at Villa. That's interesting that they've tied him up for a long-term contract. The Messi situation, yes, he's willing to stay at Barcelona for another season, but what remit has Ronald Koeman got to rebuild the fortunes of that club and where that club goes going forward? That's going to be interesting. And that whole saga of him handing in his transfer request at the end of last month, just after the Champions League final was concluded, I think has been very damaging for football as well, because the only way he could actually technically leave that club if Barcelona were really going to be forceful on the transfer fee was a Bosman ruling, which neither side wanted to do. So both sides basically backed down. Barcelona basically saying, we will invoke a transfer clause. Messi going, I don't want to take you to court. But he's clearly frustrated, and question marks have to be asked over the structures of that club, considering their financial situation. And of course, we still don't have a set date for fans being allowed back into stadiums on a permanent basis. Obviously, the Scottish government stated that they wanted them back by this time. That's now been pushed back to October the 4th as a provisional date. So there's been a few trial experiments with fans in stadiums, but we just don't know. Lewis Hamilton, with his ongoing protests at every podium presentation in the F1, is just getting tiresome now. I think he's mixing politics with sport is a slippery slope, and as we've seen, it's becoming more slippery, more divisive than it needs to be. So that's becoming a wider issue, mixing the sport and the politics. I think we've got to a point now where fans are starting to switch off in large numbers. We've seen obviously the issues with Sky with their change of the panel on Soccer Saturday and the reaction from fans to that decision by the broadcaster. Obviously Comcast now owns Sky Sports and Sky TV. So there's a restructuring going on there, which they already said they were going to do. They were going to assess the business and restructure it over the next year or so. So that's going to be interesting how that plays out and how many more people decide to switch off from and turn off from Sky Sports. What is going on with my chat? Yes. Right. So we're having issues with the chat not working properly. Let's have a look. Right, so we're having issues with the chat, so I have to get the pop-up chat, so that's taking a bit longer. I haven't seen any of the NFL, but it's interesting. The only stadium, the only team that's had any fans in attendance is Jacksonville, the team with the lowest average attendance in the league. So it's interesting that one of the epicenters of the coronavirus second wave in the US, Florida, is the only stadium that's allowed fans back in. It boggles the mind. I haven't watched any of the NFL games. I haven't watched any of the NHL playoffs either. So we are going to have an interesting Stanley Cup final, I believe. But it's interesting. The fact that a betting company has been streaming games is concerning for me going forward. I've noticed at any time I'm watching an NRL game live or the Tour de France live, and then I go on YouTube to watch a video, the first 5 or 6 ads will be sports betting based. And the videos I'll be watching could be anything. They could be gaming videos on a few of the gaming channels that I follow. Could be on the Aquajigger channel, which is a metal detecting history channel that I follow. I have noticed when I'm watching a live stream of sport, be it on YouTube or on ITV when watching the Tour de France or watching the NRL on the Watch NRL app, and then I go on YouTube, the first ads you see, sports betting. I don't like that. But no, the NFL, only one team has allowed fans back in, and that's the Jaguars. But they're used to social distancing and not filling out that stadium. They can never fill out that stadium. I mean, if you were to get every Jaguars fan in London, they wouldn't fill out Wembley. And that's partly due down to how poor the team has been for years. But that's a Florida problem. We've seen this in all the professional sports in Florida. They regularly fail to sell out arenas and stadiums, even if the team is successful. The only reason why Tampa Bay Lightning managed to, sell out their arena is because they were giving away free tickets for years or half-price tickets to social activity groups and high schools and stuff just to pack out the stadium. They were giving away heavily discounted tickets, and they were making a loss for many years. The fact that the Tampa Bay Lightning are regularly in the playoffs, they've won a Stanley Cup, they've reached another Stanley Cup final, and they're on the verge of making another one, belies the fact that for many years they couldn't get fans. Look at the Florida Panthers. It's amazing because Florida is a melting pot. You look at Miami, you look at Orlando, you look at Tampa. Yeah, there's a lot of old people in Florida because it's retirement central for the US East Coast. But you look at Florida, and they have a very young demographic as well. They've got a great university sports program in Miami. They had some very successful teams: the Dolphins, the Tampa Bay Lightning, the Buccaneers have won a Super Bowl. They've had some very successful teams in Florida. There's a reason why David Beckham has decided to put his Florida franchise, his Miami team in the MLS in Florida. There's a reason why he's chosen Florida and not another location. There is a clear reason why there's a lot of sports teams in Florida. NASCAR has Daytona in Florida. So there's Miami Homestead. There's a reason why sport likes Florida. There is a lot of corporate money in Florida, and there is actually a younger demographic as well. But here's the issue, I think, is that for whatever reason, wherever the teams are based in Florida, they do struggle to draw, regardless of the success of the team. So it is an interesting one. And a lot of the old people in Florida mostly are golf fans. They like golf. I'm surprised there's not more golf courses in Florida, but on the PGA circuit. But it is an interesting fact that Florida teams, regardless of success, do fail to draw fans regularly. The Tampa Bay Lightning, I think, draw the highest average attendance for arena size, partly because they're successful, but also they did a drive where they gave discounted tickets, and they were giving away tickets for free. They were just printing tickets like they were money. The team did make a loss, and there were concerns when the team was first there. They might have to move, relocate. Then they win a Stanley Cup in 2004. They win a Stanley Cup, and that changed the fortunes of the team around, but they still struggled to draw. The fact that they got 2 NHL teams, both have been Stanley Cup finals. One has won, but I don't understand. Some of the best athletes in the world in all the sports that are played in North America play in Florida. Yet they can't draw fans. You would think they would get more fans down there. And yes, it is a nice climate. And you look at when it comes to free agency in the North American sports, Tom Brady has gone to Tampa Bay. If Tampa Bay, when fans are allowed back in, do not watch the Buccaneers, I will be scratching my head. one of the biggest talking points in NFL history for a generation. Oh, my mustache is annoying. I've got a wonky mustache. Tom Brady going to Tampa Bay. If the Buccaneers cannot draw fans after that with what they have just signed, I don't understand. And Florida is a desirable location for a lot of athletes because the income tax, the state income tax, and the tax laws, that does make it interesting for athletes to go, oh, I can keep more of my wage packet. I can keep more of what I earn out of my wage packet. And we're not even getting to escrow and bonuses and other luxury taxes because there are other ways that they get taxed. But you look at some of the teams that play in higher tax areas or in Canada, and they do sometimes, when it comes to free agency, struggle to get that big name player who's off contract because of the tax laws. Florida, you look at the teams in Florida and look who plays for them. In the various leagues, you just look who plays for them and you're scratching your head going, why are these fans not turning up? They've got some of the best players in American football, baseball, soccer in America, or our football, the NHL. They're playing here. Yet fans aren't turning up yet. They are producing great quality sport. And that's where it becomes a head scratcher. Because it's a very enticing place for athletes to go. And there's a reason why David Beckham has put his MLS franchise there in Miami. There is a reason. It'll be interesting to see when fans are allowed back in, how many actually buy into Miami. How many fans actually do go into Miami. It'd be very, very interesting to see what happens down there when fans are allowed in attendance and how successful the team is. They were, but they weren't. They weren't selling out as many games as people believe. And yeah, LeBron is a brilliant player, and he is the NBA's biggest seller at the moment. He's their biggest, obviously, selling point globally. But the Miami Heat, they have struggled to draw fans, and they have been a reasonably successful team, and it is a head scratcher. But here's the thing: sport going forward, as I've discussed with the ECB and their financial issues, they're cutting jobs. So this is what gets me: is American sports trying to carry on with their various corporate things in place, and they're trying to carry on regardless and get seasons completed. But then it affects what next season looks like. But European and Australasian sport is really feeling the financial hit. If teams like Barcelona, with the reach of Barcelona, are basically on the verge of bankruptcy, it begs the question about how sport is governed, the transparency, the financial overspend, because it's been, you look at the spending, it's out of control. It's unsustainable. And when Augustin Pichot, as I said in the ECB video I did earlier, was standing for election for World Rugby against Bill Beaumont, he stated in his manifesto that the top-end talent has to take a wage cut, and this is before COVID, this is just after the World Cup, has to take a wage cut to make the sport more sustainable and more profitable long-term. Augustin Pichot came out and said, before the pandemic, rugby union at the professional level, and to increase the growth of the game, the top-end talent has to take less money, so the other professionals on the lower levels of the professional spectrum on the wage scale can earn a little bit more, but also make the sport more sustainable and more profitable. And this is something that sport needs to realise, is some of the top-end talent is massively overpaid, and there's a massive wedge at the top, and it's imbalanced. And what has been exposed during the last 7-8 months is how imbalanced the finances of professional sport is. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the salary caps in the North American sports. Look, the LA Chargers. I mean, look, the Oakland Raiders, now the Vegas Raiders, and the Chargers with their kind of stadium rebuild and all that. Yeah, unless they can get fans to pay, it's like Tottenham with their stadium rebuild at White Hart Lane. They are heavily reliant on the NFL playing games in London, which is not going to happen this season, by the way. Just putting it out there, to pay off that stadium debt. The team hasn't been successful. Worst Arsenal, their biggest rivals, Arsenal, had the worst league season in 30 years, win 2 trophies in the space of a couple of weeks. Tottenham can't win anything. So instead of building on success and having the success first and then building the stadium, they've banked on, we've got some good young players, we've got a good squad, we're going to build a stadium. They sacked Pochettino, brought in Mourinho, win nothing. And on the rugby side of things, I don't mind a rugby player earning $500,000 a year, because a Premier League player earns that in 2 weeks. This is where football is a big problem. Rugby union, I mean, rugby league, there are some players who are earning £800,000 to $1 million Australian or whatever it is. I think the top paid player, I think, is Sonny Bill Williams when he was at the Wolfpack. But I think some of the top paid players in the NRL are earning 1.2 to 1.4 million Australian dollars, which works out at about, I think, 750 to 800,000 pounds, depending on the day of the exchange rate. But you look at how much they earn a year, and you compare that to a top flight football player like Gareth Bale, who's a bench warmer at the moment for Real Madrid, and he earns that in a month. There is a disparity between sports as well. I think the rugby players do deserve, as a whole average and as a whole, should get paid more. But that does mean that the top end talent have to take a salary cut in order to sustain the sport. And I think that's what Pichot's getting at. He's not against them earning more money, but in order for them to do that long term, top end talent needs to take wage cuts and you know, yeah, and there are some on the lower level earning 20, 30, 40, 50 grand a year. And this is what's killing rugby union in Australia, is the rugby league and the AFL can pay better salaries. The salary cap's higher. And what we've seen is at youth level, and at national level, before you get onto Super Rugby, is they're switching codes. When they're 18, 19, they're playing their youth level, and they're under 21s, rugby union, rugby league, and AFL come along and say, look, we can give you a better base salary starting off, and we can give you more training prospects to get you a trade outside of rugby union. When you, let's say, you retire because you're injured or you don't quite make it, we can give you training in the building trade, setting up your own business. You can stay involved in the sport as a coach. And rugby league and AFL in Australia and New Zealand to a certain extent is pinching players from rugby union because they can pay them more at the lower grades. There's a healthier state competitions outside Queensland and New South Wales. Western Australia, they've got a decent state level. Victoria, it's growing. I mean, they can pinch players. And rugby union's bleeding talent to the other codes in Australia, but then it's bleeding talent out of Australia to Europe and North America because, again, they can get a base salary that's more, which affects the Wallabies' performance on the field. Look at the World Cup. And the fact that the only way that the Wallabies can compete at international level is to overplay rugby league players to get them to turn codes, swap codes for a couple of years, pay them big money, and then it doesn't work at the World Cup. They've overplayed Israel Folau and Raj Radra and all. They paid them big money, and it hasn't worked out because guess what? They've actually got worse from the 2015 World Cup to last year. They regressed and were well off the pace. Oh, God. But yeah, so Augustine Pichot, while he lost that election for World Rugby, I think he should have won it personally. I think the changes he was recommending, especially to do with pay and financial structures, are clearly vital because you look at it now, the major unions are laying off staff. They're making staff redundant. They're cutting costs. They're having to streamline the structures of the business. We don't know what's going to happen with this 8 nations format because we're looking like there's regional lockdowns coming in. And to be a professional sportsman now, you've got to go into these bubbles. So watching the Tour de France, I mean, there were concerns last week with the Tour de France. They may not be able to complete the tour on the Champs-Élysées in Paris this weekend, coming this Sunday. And that's a massive concern. This is the biggest sporting event in France on an annual basis. They are concerned that they may not be able to complete the Tour de France. Now, they seem to have died away a little bit, but the concerns are still there. And it's going to be interesting. There's been a lot of riders well off the pace. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the Tour de France. There's only 5 stages left. So that's going to be interesting. And it's been a really interesting tour. It's been a wide open Tour de France this year, which is nice. And Adam Yates wearing yellow for consecutive days was positive. And he's still in with a shout with the high mountains in the Alps to possibly as an outside shot with the Tour de France. So we'll have to see what happens in the Alpine stage. But Roglic and Pogačar look far stronger. Team Ineos don't look anywhere. Their GC has fallen apart. Egan Bernal has just given up, which is a shame because it makes it interesting with some new faces winning. But Tour de France is very open this year. But then you've got the Vuelta and the Giro later on. I did not watch the Challenge Cup last weekend. Again, they've had to. It's going to be interesting to see if they can make the final. We know obviously the Wolfpack situation, and that hasn't been clarified if they're going to be able to even form a team for next season. And what's going to happen there, because they're a Canadian team, they're going to have to go into a bubble more likely than not, and it's going to be difficult for them to sign players. So we'll have to see. We'll have to see what happens going forward with the Super League and the Challenge Cup. The fact that the women's competition's just been scrapped for the rest of this year is a big thing, because the RFL as a whole organisation had to get a loan from the government to sustain itself. But they were very quick in organising that loan. Very quick. The ECB, on the other hand, are now going, we're now having to axe jobs. So, while, yes, we got some cricket on this summer, and there's still a few, I think, one days to play, a few T20s, the fact that the ECB were like, yeah, we're losing money, but they're still pushing on with the 100 format that no one wants, by the way. And none of the centrally contacted players are willing to take pay cuts, says to me that the ECB is going to have a financial shitstorm to deal with in the next 12 months, because they've already admitted that the 100 format is going to lose money, and it's going to lose anywhere from 7 to 15 million on top of the investment, they're pumping in. That's going to become a money pit, and that's concerning. I mean, the Wolfpack are saying they are hopeful of getting a team together, but if Ottawa are going to have the same challenges the Wolfpack have had in signing players, and especially overseas, Australian, Kiwi and South Sea Islanders, which is part of the problem, is the visa issue. And if next season is as impacted as this season has been, that's going to be a disaster. The fact that they managed to complete 5 rounds of the regular season and then pulled the plug and say, look, we've lost 7 key players, or 8 players if you include Sully Bill Williams going to the Roosters in the NRL, says that there is clearly a logistical issue, and whether the travel costs. While it's nice to see the sport grow, there's already a semi-professional rugby league competition on the east coast of the US and Canada anyway that they could have invested more money into and turned back to fully professional. This is the issue with rugby league. They don't have a unified international program. And so while it's nice to see Ottawa are going to come in next year, that's great. But if Toronto, the initial experiment is falling apart, quite literally, and they're saying we're hopeful of coming in next season, then I think the Broncos should be automatically allowed back up, because they were the last team to play in the Super League, relegated, who are a far better team than the Wolfpack ever were. And that's my personal opinion. They're far better organised. They've had that Super League experience. They can easily recruit players. They've got a great academy. 8 of their first team squad in the season before last season, were London-based, so local. So they're trying to grow the sport in the south of England. The Broncos are a far better bet of growing the sport in a non-traditional location than the Wolfpack. You don't have that overseas travel. You don't have to. The only place they got to go is Catalan, possibly Toulouse in the Challenge Cup in France, and that's a 2-hour flight there, and then turn around. You can do it in a day. They could fly in first thing in the morning, do a training session, play the match, fly home. Whereas Canada, that's what, 5-6 hour transcontinental flight over the Atlantic. Then you've got to deal with the jet lag. Then you've got to try and acclimatise the players, play a game, and then come back. It doesn't work. The ECB, you can't stand it. I think, the ECB's got massive problems. They're not transparent enough as an organisation. You have to ask questions where the TV money's gone over the last 15 years, because if they were really a prudent organisation, which a lot of these sport and governing bodies have clearly not been over the last 15, 20 years with all these big TV deals, where's all that Sky money gone? And all the sponsorship deals? Where has all that money they've put in the bank disappeared to? Because if they had been more prudent with their spending, and the TV deal was better structured with more free-to-air quality games, like we've seen recently, where they've given us a little drip feed, they wouldn't have to come up with the 100 format, chuck money at that, which has clearly gone down a black hole, and is going to be seriously financially a failure. That's my personal opinion, because they're already admitting they're going to make a loss. It's a nightmare. The ECB does need structural reform. There needs to be a complete reset with that organisation to be a governing body that can be trusted by the fans. And to be fair, players who are not centrally contracted are also questioning the 100 format, why the county game isn't getting the assistance it should, why TV rights aren't benefiting the grassroots level, which it clearly hasn't. It's made some people in the ECB very wealthy. It's made a couple of top-end players very wealthy, but it hasn't really benefited us, the fans, or the county game, be it first class or one day or T20 county game. That clearly hasn't worked. The The T20 competition we already have. We don't need the 100. They just need to format that correctly with the counties, but they're trying to do cities, so you lose the rivalry and you lose the kind of traditional link with the fans. That doesn't work. So the way they formatted the T20 competitions is a mess. So the ECB has to take a lot of criticism, and they need to learn from it. And unfortunately, they're not listening to the fan base. They come up with ideas that they think we want, but actually what we want is pretty set in stone. We want more free-to-air cricket. We need the county game to be supported, and we don't want this 100 format. What we want is the T20, the ODI, the one-day format, and the county game to get some free-to-air coverage and some test matches back on free-to-air TV or test series domestically. That's what we want. We don't want to have it behind a paywall because it then puts people off. And we look at the viewing figures between the Cricket World Cup last year and the peak of the Ashes 2004. That's 10 million viewers they've lost. And that's casual viewers that could have become hardcore fans. And people were buying in that summer 2005. Not because England won and beat Australia. It was the intensity of the series between two world-class teams at the top of their game over 5 test matches and the test series with Bangladesh, where the Bangladeshis actually upset the Aussies in a one-day match, I believe. And there was some really good cricket in 2005. And the ECB went, we can sign a TV deal with Sky. We've got to milk them. And they've chased the gravy train. And it's damaged it. I think all teams and sports have to write off this year as a loss in all fronts. Yeah, some sports are better equipped to deal with a financial drop in revenues. Others aren't, and it varies from league to league. So some sports have really been hammered financially and may take a decade or more to recover. Other sports have that cushion. The problem is what we've seen is no sport has dealt with this lockdown very effectively, and you've got to think of these big TV deals. Why is there not a rainy day fund? And this is where rugby league has been really hammered by the Sky Sports package, which is crap. In comparison to the NRL, the TV deal they've got is crap. And I follow the NRL religiously, and I've watched every game this season. I can tell you now the NRL is far better financially equipped to deal with the pandemic. They've restarted with fans in attendance, and they're going to complete a slightly shortened season. They managed to get the Warriors to play. Similar situation to the Wolfpack. They managed to get the Warriors stationed in Australia in a bubble. Some players had to go home, so there was a loan agreement where they could sign players on a short-term basis. The Warriors have been competitive, they've been improving, and they narrowly missed out on the finals. Even though there's 2 rounds left, they narrowly missed out. So the NRL has proven, and the Australian Rugby League Commission has proven what can be done. The RFL and the Super League has really come up short, massively. And the TV deal was part of the problem. In Australia, free-to-air and pay TV, shared rights. So the grand final is on free-to-air TV. Here, Sky Sports behind a paywall, and there's a reason why that sport is not expanding. They're talking about expansion in the NRL. The Super League is all over the place, and has to beg the government for money, whereas the NRL spoke to the government about restarting, quarantine rules, bubbles, negotiated a brand new TV deal, which basically equals the TV deal they currently have, protected the salary cap for the most part, and for the most part protected players' salaries. So who's coming out better out of this? The NRL, clearly. They managed to get Sonny Bill Williams to go to the NRL. They've got Luke Thompson to go over to the NRL. So players are willing to sign with the NRL rather than with Super League mid-season. I'm willing to go. Take the quarantine period, quarantine in the bubble, do the tests, and then start playing. So there's clearly an issue with governance. So the RFL has been screwed over by the Murdoch media empire and now Comcast with the TV deal they've got. They've got to seriously renegotiate that, make the sport more accessible. And yeah, the Broncos, I think, should be a Super League side. The issue is getting a permanent home stadium, and there is clearly a fan base here. There is clearly a fan base of rugby league in the south of England, but because of the TV deal and the lack of finance, only a handful of teams make a profit in the Super League. A couple of teams at most. We're talking 3 or 4 out of 16, 18. Make a profit. That tells you something about the state of rugby league. The fact it hasn't expanded to these new locations where there is cash to burn in real terms economically. I've been criticised about the North's economy being weaker. As I have been up north, actually. I've worked up north. I can tell you now it is more deprived. It does have less GDP per location. There is less investment. And keeping yourself in the M62 corridor is not going to be healthy for the game long term. And certain members of the RFL have said, we are seen as an outdated institution. We need to look to, look aboard. They've shortened it to a 20-round NRL season rather than 27. So some teams play each other once, other teams play each other twice. They've had to refixture it. So Penrith have played, I think, the North Queensland Cowboys twice, for example. They played Parramatta twice, but they haven't played the Roosters. It's just how it's worked out. They've worked out with the fixturing. Certain teams have played each other twice, like Canberra and the Storm have played each other twice, won a game each. Brisbane and the Gold Coast played each other twice. Gold Coast have won both games for the first time ever, and 3 in a row for the first time ever against Brisbane. So it is interesting how they've shortened it. It just means that you've got a few less games to play. There's no bye weeks. State of Origin's at the end of the season. No test matches. So, while it's not a perfect season, it's actually made the season far more interesting. Because now the top 8 are set as the top 8. It's what order they finish in. Penrith are likely to get the minor premiership, and each time they win the minor premiership, they win the grand final. So Penrith are in the pole position. The Roosters and Manly are chasing them for second. They're trying to chase them down, but it looks like that's going to be the battle for second. The Raiders are up there. There are some teams that have missed out who otherwise, if this had been a full-length season, might have got in, like the Warriors, for example. Cronulla have just held on by the skin of teeth. Newcastle have dropped back a bit. You've got the Rabbitohs up there. So it's become a very interesting dynamic in the top 8. But it is what it is. Super League, NRL, State of Origin, internationals are different rules. The Super League and NRL have now got very similar rules. They've gone with the wrong ref system. The NRL's gone with the 6 again rule, which I think speeds up the game. Internationals, you can still fight. State of Origin has slightly different rules to mainstream NRL. Although I think the Australian Rugby League Commission are trying to unify the rules for the NRL and then the representative competitions. Internationals, again, slightly different rules. Super League is a different play the ball rule. So it would be nice to see a unified set of rules for the code. And this is where Rugby League does have a problem, but Ice Hockey has a different set of rules for each league. If you look at the Ice Hockey, the IIHF rule books, and then the NHL rinks are smaller. The KHL has a mix of rinks. So if you look at Ice Hockey, that's another sport that has variable rules depending on the league, the country, what the import, how many overseas players you're allowed. There are various rules in place at the various ice hockey leagues and competitions. So that's something else, but that's a very successful international sport. It actually makes ice hockey makes more money than rugby league globally. There you go. Has more registered players, bigger TV deals globally. So that's something that it's worth billions. Rugby league is worth hundreds of millions. So you can clearly see the difference in finances. I mean, the Brisbane Broncos are worth 50 odd million in revenue. Wealthiest rugby league team. The Rangers are worth over $1 billion US. So you can see the disparity. It's there. Could the rugby codes ever unite? No. The games have diverged with a different style of reset of play, lineouts. Union has lineouts, league doesn't. Scrums are different. The way the game's played is completely different. The tackle area, the play of the ball, maul in rugby union, you can't. There'll be a lot of rule changes you would have to do, and if you were to reunite it into just rugby, I don't think it would work with the structures that are already in place, and the style of play is completely different, and the physicality you need is different. And I don't think you could reunite because the fans' difference as well, especially in the UK. Australia is different because the Roosters is an upper class club. Brisbane is the city club, so everyone from working class, middle, upper class all follows the Broncos. Gold Coast, same. North Queensland Cowboys is the same because they're one club, one city kind of things at the top level. Same with Canberra and Melbourne. In Australia, it's different with the fan-based structure on the social-economic level. In the UK, it's mostly a working man's game for the most part, although there are some wealthier fans. It's a different style of game. It's completely it's like trying to get AFL to merge with the NRL and go, right, we'll have a joint code. It just wouldn't work. The sports and the codes have evolved to suit the style of play, and they have evolved, and it's completely different. So there's a reason why what we call football has evolved in Canadian football, NFL. North American football's got Canadian Football League and the National Football League. And then you look at collegiate, which is again a different set of rules. And then you look at Aussie rules, Gaelic football, association football, rugby league review. You've got about 7 or 8, 9 different codes of football, and it's just it wouldn't work. And the same could be said for women's rugby as well. They've got a women's rugby league competition in both the Super League and NRL. You've got women's AFL. So again, the existing codes have already got start-up leagues that have been going now for a couple of years, and some of these players now going professional. You've already got the structures in place, the institutions in place for those leagues and those sports, those codes of football, so to speak, to stay in place. You could not reunify them. It would be an absolute shit show. And we're already having complaints about sports governance not being good enough now. You imagine trying to come up with a brand new sport where you unite both codes of rugby and possibly Aussie rules and you tweak the American. That'd be insane. Sport evolves naturally. And that's why we see changes to sport constantly, where certain sports are standalone, but they evolve, and the rules around them evolve. And then they could do a World Club Challenge, but there's only 4 NRL women's teams. There's more women's teams in the Super League structure, so that in itself would pose a problem for player depth. But it is something feasible in the future, down the line, a World Club Challenge. You could have the 4 women's NRL teams playing the top 4 of the Women's Super League, or the Super League Grand Final winners, the Challenge Cup winners, and then 2 other invitational teams. That in itself is a possibility as the game grows and as more women decide to play rugby league in Australia. I think that is totally plausible. But you're going to have to improve the player depth in the Australian game to compete with what is massively growing in the women's game. I think there's more women's teams in the UK when it comes to rugby league than in Australia, and it's about growing the sport. So until the Australian equivalent can catch up with what's happened in the Super League, the Women's Super League, and the women's clubs across all levels, I think it's doable. I think the women's. I mean, this weekend is Women in League round in the NRL, so there's clearly a drive to grow the women's game in Australia and New Zealand to match over here in the UK. Ironically, the women's international teams. I think the Kiwis are actually Australia. I think the Kiwis are the best rugby league team in the women's game. There is clearly a drive to improve it and grow it and get more women playing. And more grassroots clubs. There is clearly a drive there from youth level all the way up to senior. I think there is a growing trend. I think the women's game is dealt with better over here, but the fact that the RFL said we're not going to play a women's season or Challenge Cup or complete is a massive blow to player development, sport development. That's a massive hammer blow for the women's sport. And the fact that the RFL had to seek a loan from the government, there are concerns about the finances of the sport at all levels over here in the UK, and there has been for a while at the RFL, and the clubs themselves are struggling financially. There's a reason why the best talent that the UK has to offer in rugby league, and I think some French players are starting to look at the NRL as well. Are looking at Australia and New Zealand to play long term. There is a reason why there's a bleeding of talent. And I was watching an interview with Sam Burgess on the Matty Johns podcast, his interview, and he said, by the time of the World Cup in 2021, we could have a whole starting 13 based in the NRL. We could actually put out a whole starting 13. There's enough players eligible to play for Great Britain or England who are currently playing in the NRL, and that tells you something about the state of the sport, both here and there, is that we could put out a whole international side based on NRL players who are either eligible through parents who actually are born and bred here who've gone over to play. That tells you something about the state of play and the fact that there's more of them willing to go over and play their careers there. I mean, we've got Ryan Hall, you got, I think it's George or Tom Burgess still at the Rabbitohs. You've got like 4 or 5 members of the Canberra Raiders are English. McQueen, who plays for the Tigers, he has won a State of Origin. He has played, he's won a grand final, but he can represent England. He has done before, even though he's a bit popular at the Tigers at the moment, but he's eligible for England. You've got I think someone playing at the Brisbane Broncos. You've got Thompson at the Bulldogs. There's a few others, I think, willing to go over there. And you look at the press coverage as well. And this is something that Sam Burgess mentioned in his interview. He was doing a one-to-one interview on the Matty Johns podcast. He goes, when I was playing at Bradford, I always obviously he said he wanted to play in the NRL and test himself. So he came over actually quite young in his career. I think he was only about 21. When he lands at the airport, there's 30 or 40 cameras waiting for him. All the newspapers, the TV networks, they're waiting for him to get off the plane. Not because Russell Crowe's the owner of the team that he plays for, or played for, now coaches for the Rabbitohs. But they were there for him. He said we might get one or two press photographers at a game. It's a Challenge Cup game, he might get a few more because of the wider TV audience. But there was quite a lot. Now, he switched to rugby union. Yeah, there was a lot of interest in the national media when he went to play for Bath in England. He got some unfair criticism by the national media, which I felt was unfair on the England team. I think it was far bigger issues with that England setup in 2015 at the Home World Cup than just Sam Burgess. Far bigger issues in the media. And it didn't work out for various reasons. He goes back to the rugby league and he still, does his thing. And he goes, the media interest here is far bigger than the media interest in rugby league over here. And this is where I think another issue is, got it behind a paywall. There's limited free-to-air coverage. There's a World Cup coming next year. Where's the interest? Where's the sudden media interest in saying, right, we've got an international tournament for the second time in 8 years. Let's really drive the interest. Let's grow the game. And I look at the stadiums they've selected, and they've been safe in a lot of them. And the scary thing is when the Kiwis went over, I think it was in 2018, and played the Test series in 2018, they couldn't fill the whole City Stadium. They couldn't fill Anfield, and they couldn't fill what's the Leeds stadium? Headingley. There were empty seats at Headingley. There were empty seats at Hull, and they couldn't even fill the lower bowl at Anfield. So they really weren't, really selling the game up north. And I've had questions about why there isn't a rugby league team professionally in Liverpool. They've tried and they've failed. St Helens is where the fan base is, and those scousers, like James Graham, don't want to watch in Liverpool. They'll happily travel down the road to St Helens. It's only a 20-minute drive or something like that, half hour down the motorway. They'll happily go to St Helens to watch a game. So that tells you something about a city of Liverpool standing when it comes to sport. We've had boxers come out of Liverpool. We've had cyclists, swimmers, gymnastics, Beth Treville. Obviously football with Liverpool and Everton. And I suppose you could add Tranmere to the Merseyside area. But rugby league and rugby union, it doesn't. You would think a university town. You would think league and union that they might have university. It doesn't seem to be a thing that the Scouts public wants to buy into for whatever reason. I find that really bizarre. But yeah, there is better standard of play, better wages, more prestige, more media attention. You look at the TV deal that's been signed with Channel 9 and Foxtel. It's worth a hell of a lot more than what we get with Sky Sports and BBC over here for the Challenge Cup and Super League. There is no comparison. Absolutely no. It's like 100 million Australian dollars per season from just Foxtel alone. That's not including Channel 9, which gets the big games on free to air over a period of time. And then you look at what Sky Sports are paying, it's nowhere, not even close. Not even close. And that is generally concerning going forward. Is Peter V'landys has gone out and got Abdo as the new NRL CEO, and he seems to actually have his head glued on, and he's not giving lip service. He's actually doing his job as NRL CEO, and V'landys as ARL, Australian Rugby League Commissioner. He's managed to get the game restarted, and he's worked through all the protocols to put bubbles in place. They've got fans back. There's no comparison in the organisation and the governance. It's far better. It's far better down under than here, and the same could be said of the AFL as well. While they were caught on the back foot by the NRL. But again, they've got games played, they've got fans in stadiums. They're willing to allow State of Origin to take place in Adelaide, their turf, in November, game one. But they've worked far better in negotiating with state governments in order to get games played, fans back in, putting teams in bubbles, players misbehaving do get punished, fined, etc. Over here, the sports reaction has been shambolic. Rugby union's reaction has been shambolic. The football over here has been an absolute shambles. That there are teams basically facing going out of business within the next season. And the fact that teams were already struggling financially before the pandemic, Bury is the example I always use. This time last year, Bury had just gone out of business. Bolton had just survived. Macclesfield, it was dragging on all season. Says that there is massive strains and stresses already with the structures of football and football governance that could have been remedied for 20 odd years. And unfortunately, the weight of the finance is far too top heavy. And the bottom is suffering badly, and it's completely unbalanced. And it's not sustainable. And what we've seen is if Manchester United, the best financially run club, we can discuss their failures on the field. It's a different thing. Off the field, they are run really well financially. I was saying we're losing 5 million a day without fans in attendance per week. It's 35 million a week. There's only so much time before a club that well run with that corporate reach, those sponsorship deals, and those sales of merchandise will go, yeah, we're now making a loss, an actual loss. They're still actually profitable, but they're losing money, so their profits are shrinking. And it will get to a point where they start making losses, real losses rather than actual losses. Barcelona, look at the mess they're in. A club of Barcelona, an equal club of equal standing, how badly financially managed they have been. It doesn't matter about the TV rights at this point. We have to ask the question about the lack of transparency in sports governance. When we go back to the ECB and you look at the NRL, the reason why Todd Greenberg went out the door is the players were like, okay, we're going to have to take pay cuts in the short to medium term until we can restart, if we restart. Teams could go out of business. They went to the Players' Pension Fund and a third of it was missing, misappropriated. The reaction to that misappropriation of funds was such that Todd Greenberg basically was out the door as NRL CEO within weeks. And Andrew Abdo was put in. And V'landys took a much stronger role in the governance of the game, in reorganising it, getting matches back on, getting the season restarted, reorganising, shortening the calendar. And while it's not perfect that State of Origin is at the end of the season, they didn't know if this season would be completed. So they've shortened it to 20 rounds, which actually makes it really interesting this season. You've got State of Origin straight after the grand final within 2 weeks. And, the difference in governance is striking. But for years, rugby league and AFL had poor governance. It really did. It wasn't always this well governed or this, the NRL's position. The NRL has actually got more employees in head office. And this is true. The NRL has more employees in head office than the Premier League. So there are some issues with, even though a league like the NRL, which has proven it can get restarted, fans can come back in, a new TV deal can be struck. There's still shocking governance issues that need to be fixed. But then you come across the Northern Hemisphere and you look at the mess that is rugby union, cricket, football, rugby league. North American sport is a shambles. I mean, Major League Baseball, God, that was a mess earlier in the summer. The only sport I think that comes out really smelling of roses, apart from NASCAR, is the NHL. Every other sport has just really, I think, struggled. And the NHL is struggling, don't get me wrong. But they really worked quite well in getting the bubble cities in Canada. They worked out. Canada's got better control of the virus. We're more likely to get, most of the players are Canadian. We can get this sport up and running. The issue is the lower levels of the sport professionally, the AHL, the ECHL, the sport in Europe. Will that survive? So while the big leagues are restarting, the lower levels of professionalism, the minor leagues, the lower leagues, teams could go out of business. Leagues could go bust. And there is a concern that because the weight of the finances at the top and the TV and media deals aren't as strong lower down for whatever reason. Oh, it's not the big league, therefore we don't have to pay any attention to it, which I think is a big imbalance when it comes to TV deals and TV rights, media rights, local and state and national media rights. It does create an imbalance up here. So when clubs up here like Barcelona, Manchester United are reporting losses, imagine what's happening lower down. Imagine what's happened right at the bottom. Because if you start taking clubs out like a Bury, like a Macclesfield, like a Bolton, that weight is going to really it's going to implode. And the mess that will make will be far more damaging, I think, than people realise. The money bubble in sport is starting to deflate. How sport has got to this stage is it got greedy. And this is what the ECB is finding out. They've chased the gravy train. This is what I started in the middle. They've chased the gravy train. And they're still pushing ahead with this 100 format. They've got no plans to shelve it. They've invested too much money now. Well, they've lost too much money now. And they've admitted it's going to make a loss. But they haven't got a plan B. And what fans were saying was, you've got the T20 competition with the counties. There's your plan B. Restructure that so all 18 top-tier counties play in a competition. Put a lot of it on free-to-air TV, shared rights with Sky. You've solved your problem of accessibility. But they're going with 100. They're not willing to listen to people outside the box, the fans, the actual consumers of the sport that are turning off in droves and are losing interest in a sport that 15, 20 years ago people couldn't get enough of. And it is seen as elitist, and it is seen as for the rich people. And it's not. But there's the problem. They're losing the middle ground. They've lost a huge possibility of an untapped fan base. It's just been switched off because it's been made inaccessible by the way the TV deals are structured and the way the ECB runs itself. The problem is... Oh, yeah, look, the ECB have really mismanaged things for 15 years. There is no denying that. But they're not the only governing body that has been guilty of mismanagement of the sport and not planning for the eventuality that there may be a stoppage in play for whatever reason. It could be a player strike. It could have been a player strike at any point. There could have been social unrest. Let's say there could have been riots for all we know, and they're going, we can't play games for a little bit. There could have been any number of issues that could have come out of nowhere. The fact that it was shut down by health issues and a global pandemic is a thing, but they weren't planning for anything. They were just going, the Sky money keeps coming in. But then they were looking at the viewing figures on Sky and they were plummeting. So they overflogged the Ashes series to try and keep the interest coming in, and they flogged that horse to death. They overdid the Ashes rivalry. And the same can be said in Australia. They're getting sick and tired of watching England every other year. Yeah, it's a great rivalry, but I think they've oversold it and they've worn out that rivalry where it's lost its magic, it's lost its sparkle. It's people are going, we're just seeing the same players all the time. And Cricket Australia's got its own problems. They've had sandpapergate. The sports will survive. I said this in previous live streams when we got, sports, they're going to go to the wall. They will survive in some way, shape or form. And they will grow again. They'll rise again. But sports governance has to be looked at. And it's across the board. It doesn't matter if it's professional football, with the Premier League, the Football League, the FA, down to ice hockey. There's enough amateur players to keep the sport going and create a rebirth. To indoor bowls, there you go, there's a sport. These sports, be it amateur, semi-pro, professional, will survive. There will still be people participating in them. But the way they're governed, the way they're structured financially, the transparency, how they're structured, needs to be addressed. It has, the way sport is governed, the finance side of things as well. There's been a lot of, let's chase the pay-per-view sports subscription channels, and the pay-per-view channels are getting less. There seems to be a drip feed of more free-to-air sports coverage coming back, but certain sports have killed off their fan base, damaged themselves with their image. F1, MotoGP, Superbikes, they've just been taken off free-to-air for years. And it's now they're starting to feel it heavily. And Lewis Hamilton and F1 getting all political, more than just the team politics, but actual politics. they're just a bunch of hypocrites. They actually do live outside the real world. They live in their own world. And their image has gone down the toilet. People are switching off in droves. MotoGP's lost a lot of viewers because it's on BT Sport when it used to be free to air. That's a massive shame. That was brilliant when it was on Channel 5 to begin with, then BBC. They shot themselves in the foot again with greed. Superbikes has been off free to air for a very long time. When Eurosport went off free to air and became subscription, it did harm a lot of motorsport, which it's a shame. You say arena sports, yes and no, but at the same time, again, it's funding, sponsorships, accessibility. It's all well and good saying, I like basketball, I like netball, futsal, five-a-side, whatever it may be. Badminton. There you go. There's an indoor sport. Badminton, table tennis. You can play that indoors, right? A lot of these are in Olympic sports, especially basketball, netball, that are played. But here's the thing, and this is something to bear in mind: the media side of things, how you sell that to a wider audience and get an audience entertained by giving them media rights. We've seen the media companies throw their toys out the pram because the Premier League couldn't restart. They demanded money back. If we're seeing the bigger professional sports going to the government going, we need a cash loan to survive at all levels, not just the Super League, Rugby League. Can you give us some money? We risk going out of business. That tells you there's problems. So these minor sports, they're you know, there you go. There's not enough facilities, and this is where it comes with the sports infrastructure. We mentioned this before with the closure of ice rinks and the fact that the EIHL season and the NIHL seasons may not take place. There is a concern about the infrastructure being available and who owns sports arenas and stadiums. We've seen it in football with Coventry, with the Ricoh. That's a prime example. We've seen it with Wimbledon not having a home ground because they're sharing it in Kingston upon Thames. Other teams like Northampton, I think, had issues at one. These are ongoing issues. Like professional football, a lot of clubs don't own their own stadiums. It's the same in rugby league. The only team in the NRL to own its own stadium is Cronulla, and they're rebuilding their stadium. So the issues are long-standing. As my neighbours making noise outside, that's just all you need for a live stream. But the stadium and arena infrastructure, who owns what? This is what's creating issues now in professional semi-pro sport in this country. There are some leagues and some sports not sure if they're going to have arenas to play in for teams who are the tenants of these arenas because they don't own them. Or the people who own the team also own the arena they rent. So there's concerns about all sorts. I mean, it's all sports. It doesn't matter if it's... I mean, look at Bradford Bulls and Odsal. They're now playing in Dewsbury. And there's direct RFL involvement with the Bradford Bulls in their long-term survival. Widnes. The council owns the stadium via a holding company. So rugby league's had this problem. Football's had this problem. Coventry is a prime example of a club that doesn't own its stadium. I mean, Chelsea don't technically own Stamford Bridge. So some really big, well-known teams that have played at the top level in their sport don't necessarily own their infrastructure. And the Bradford Bulls, I mean, that's a story of shame, how that was mismanaged. One of the most successful teams at the time. Look where they are now. They're in an absolute mess. They can't play in their own stadium, which was a terrible facility from what it could have been. They're now stadiumless. They're now having to share facilities with Dewsbury Rams. The RFL got involved in running the day-to-day running of the club to keep the club going. They've been into administration. Same with Widnes. They've had their problems. That's a mess. That's another mess. Widnes Vikings. These are two, in their history, very successful clubs who've played in the top level and then in the Super League. They've won Challenge Cups. They've won the old top division, and they've played in Super League, who are both now outside the Super League, and they've both been in administration. And it should never have happened. And they both have stadium issues, like who owns their stadium and where they can play. And this has all happened in the last decade. And it does make you wonder what's going on. And the fact that they don't actually own their stadiums tells you a lot of their problems. They're tenants. So they have to pay money to the stadium owners. So the questions have to be asked about sports ownership and governance and who owns the infrastructure and the finances and there's a whole host of issues. And the Bradford Bulls has been a situation which is a dire situation that it's getting worse, it seems. The stadium at Valley Parade isn't big enough. The in-goal areas would be tiny. Valley Parade, the pitch, I think the pitch would not be wide enough for rugby league or long enough. I mean, yes, you've got Valley Parade, and I think Bradford City. I think the pitch quality wouldn't be good enough as well because you're playing Football League on there, and Valley Parade. The pitch is known to be a poor surface. Even by modern day standards, it's not a great surface. It doesn't drain very well, and if you play rugby league in the summer, football in the winter, that's gonna be all round year use, constantly be used all year basically, and that would just churn up. And some of the thunderstorms we had in end of July, beginning of August, if you're playing rugby league on that, and then start the football season, that would be a mud bath by the end of August. And yeah, we're having great weather right now. We're having a heat wave. But you look at the weather we had with those thunderstorms in July and August. Rugby league will be playing in July. And then in August, you'll have to start the football season. That pitch would have been wrecked by September. And then with autumn coming, the end of the rugby league season, beginning the hardcore of the football season, you go through that. Rugby league starts again in February, and then it just will churn up. It would never get any time, get any break. It would be used 24/7, 12 months a year. That pitch would be a disaster. That pitch would be cut to pieces, and it would never have time to be maintained by the groundsmen. They would have to relay it twice a season, I would think, and it wouldn't bed in. The fact that the Bulls have got into it would look like passion. It would. Proper old school stadium, but I don't think that would give the best flowing rugby league or best flowing football. And I think with the evolution of sport, you want quicker pace play, and if you have a chopped up pitch that is literally just a mud bath, like Workington Town in the 2013 World Cup, when I think New Zealand played Scotland up in Workington in 2013, and it just rained and rained and rained. The pitch, you couldn't distinguish the Kiwis from the Scots. That's what it would look like very quickly. The fact that the Bulls have gone into administration 3 times, liquidated as well, that really is concerning. The fact that there is direct involvement from the governing body. They obviously want the team to continue. What is scary and generally terrifying is the Bradford Bulls were one of the best teams in the country in the 2000s into the 2010s. They were a top flight team, and Sam Burgess, and the fact the Burgess twins and his older brother, I think Luke Burgess, they've all played for the Bulls. They've all come through that youth system. I think, was it George or Tom started the professional career at South Sydney? They took a year longer through the youth system, but they've all come through the Bulls youth system. But they all left roughly at the same time, and then within a year, the team's got into administration. That is deeply concerning. The financial state of the Bulls off the field and what's going on. It's a disaster. Should it have been allowed to happen? No. But then you have to question the TV deal that's in place with the Super League, Championship and League One. And the only free-to-air coverage you get is the Challenge Cup. So you do have to question the TV deal in place and why it's a pittance. You also have to question the RFL as a governing body and their lack of expansion in the south of England and parts of France. They tried actually in Paris with PSG. That didn't work very well. Let's not kid ourselves. PSG did have a Super League team and it was shockingly bad. But the heartland of rugby league in France is the southwest. And there's only 2 teams out the French system that are good enough to play in the Super League system. One in the Super League, one in the Championship, Toulouse and Catalan. But you have to look at it and go, okay, why is it then that we are not growing the sport in these other locations, which doesn't mean massive travel, but we're interested in Canada across a 5-hour flight. That to me is a head scratcher. There's already a semi-professional rugby league competition on the East Coast of the US and Canada that exists that could use assistance and could turn pro. The problem is the current TV deal that the RFL and Super League has signed, because it's actually the RFL that signs all the TV deals for all the competitions, not the Super League. It's the RFL as the governing body that ticks things off. much like the Australian Rugby League Commission in Australia for state of origin, the internationals, and the NRL. It's the Australian Rugby League Commission that ticks off the TV deals with Peter V'landys. The RFL, the questions have to be asked of why their TV deal is worth fuck all in comparison to the NRLs, and why the best talent that we have produced in the last 20 years, starting with Adrian Morley, have been going over to the NRL and in growing numbers. I mean, there's, I think, 4 or 5 players on the Canberra squad are English. Now, Bateman's coming back, but will he stay for a season or two? I think it's to do with family reasons, but he could go back to Australia again. I don't think he's fully finished in the NRL. He's still young enough, I think, to play a couple more seasons at the NRL level. Adrian Morley flip-flopped. He went between the two. And Adrian Morley, if you think about it, is, I think, possibly the most dominant forward ever. And you're looking at professional games he's played more than Cameron Smith. He's played more top-grade games in both the Super League and the NRL than Cameron Smith has. Adrian Morley is the most dominant forward of all time. Absolute man, mountain, absolute animal. He could have played more games had he not been suspended as much. I don't know. It's interesting how Catalan and Toulouse are doing quite well. Again, it comes down to governance. The French governing body has gone, okay, we'll allow these teams to play in the English system and come under the RFL's umbrella with certain input from us. But bearing in mind it's from their traditional heartland of the sport as well. So even the French system is like, southwest of France. We're not going to branch into the capital. We've tried that. We're not going to try it again. And this is where I find it bizarre. The French capital has taken on rugby union quite well. The national games are played there. So it is interesting when it comes to the Stade de France, the French national team at rugby union play there, most of their games. And there's several in the top 2 flights. You've got Racing, you've got Stade Francais, and in the second tier, I think you've got teams from Caen, Lille. They play in the second tier of the French rugby union system, so they have grown the sport outside of the traditional southwest of France for both coasts. But again, the PSG experiment was just badly handled. But Toulouse and Catalan, yes, they are. Catalan's obviously played in Challenge Cup finals and won a Challenge Cup, I think. Deserved one of the most entertaining Challenge Cup finals ever. Lowest crowd, but I think it might be one of the most entertaining finals ever, and rightly so. And there's still traditionalists, those, armchair critics up in the north going, we don't want these teams being successful. Rugby league in the southwest of France is a religion. It is. The fact that their 2 best teams have decided to play in the English system, I think, is an honour. I think it shows the respect that the French rugby public have for the Super League system. The issue is, I think, again, it comes down to the RFL and the French Rugby League as well, governing body. The French Federation and the RFL not really getting a good enough TV deal. And that cross-channel, the TV deal isn't good enough. And that's with both governing bodies working together, signing off on this, because the French TV deal for Catalan and Toulouse has to go in concoction with the British TV deal with Sky. They could come up with a better TV deal. It is a head scratcher. The most successful clubs come from the heartlands, and there is a phobia of going to the wealthier areas of both countries, which is the metropolitan areas around the northeast of France and the southeast of England, where most of the GDP and money is, and investment and big corporations are based. There seems to be a phobia, and there seems to be an outdated way of thinking. And I think both parties have admitted that. Both the RFL and the French Federation have admitted that. But their obsession with Canada is a head scratcher, because I don't see how that will work long term unless you actually make the Canadian and US competition on the East Coast fully professional and increase the quality level. And then you could have like some kind of round robin, kind of the winner of that competition, the winner of the Challenge Cup, the winner of the Super League, and the winner of, and that would cover the French teams as well, because Catalan have obviously won the Challenge Cup. You could have like a 3-way round robin kind of tri-nations, kind of the best French team, which is going to be Catalan, the best English team, which could be Leeds, for example, or Wigan or St Helens or Huddersfield or Wakefield, whoever it is from the Super League, and the best Canadian American team. You could have some kind of like tri-club kind of little World Club Challenge, and then you have the best Australian team. Make it a four-way kind of competition in the pre-season, which would be really interesting to see. It's feasible down the line if rugby league as a code had a bit more of a global plan in place for the club game as well as the international game, which rugby union has, in order to get the game over the line and grow it. But you need to grow in your home countries first and really grow the game there, increase your player base nationally before you start pissing around in Canada in the US. While I think it's a great idea in principle, in practice it doesn't work. Toronto's proved that. Ottawa's just going to have the same issues in growing the sport at professional level. If you can't even get the whole of the East Coast professional yet, there's no point in going, we'll have a professional club here. It just seems like they're going, right, there's some pins on the map, let's put a team here, let's put a team in. And while fans have bought in, the quality level that they're bringing to the table is just shockingly poor. The Broncos were far... If you put the Broncos last Super League season against what Toronto put up in those 5 games, there's no comparison what's the better side. And it is the Broncos by a country mile. They really got stuck in, and the fact they had 8 local-based players who came to their academy playing in the first team squad regularly throughout that season tells you all you need to know about the fact they were willing to grow the game. Toronto, not a single Canadian, there's one Canadian player out of that squad to start this. One Canadian player has stuck with them in the whole squad who's registered to play for Canada internationally. That tells you something. That tells you where we're at. You've got to grow the grassroots first before you say, right, we'll have a professional club here. It doesn't work. And the visa issue they've had as well has meant they can't complete this season, which then in itself creates problems for next season. And we don't know what's going to happen over this winter. We don't know if we're going to go into another lockdown or not. We do not know what's going to happen. And they're talking about getting a team in Ottawa. Who in the RFL is coming up with these ideas and granting the licenses for these clubs to operate? I don't get the RFL's thinking. When they have stated over the last couple of years, we need to grow the game in the south of England. Otherwise, we risk being seen as a minority sport and we will continue to lag behind rugby union. It's a no-brainer. You've got to grow at home first before you can start looking at expanding the game globally. The fact that the NRL are thinking about expansion in the next couple of years, looking at Perth, looking at a second team in Brisbane or in Queensland. Fourth team in Queensland, looking at a possibility of another team in outside Sydney and New South Wales, probably Wagga Wagga, or Dubbo, tells you that there's a shift. They might even put a team in Tasmania. Just go, sod it. It's not too far from Victoria, New South Wales by flight. Bang, we'll put a team there. The fact that the NRL was looking at expansion and the RFL going, but we'll look overseas outside of our traditional UK, France player base. We'll put a team over there where there isn't really the interest and they haven't grown the grassroots with the amateur semi-professional game on the East Coast. It's a head-scratcher, whereas in Australia, the games are broadcast nationally. They are playing State of Origin games in Perth, in Adelaide. There has been professional teams in Adelaide, in Perth, at the top level in the Super League, or the NRL when it was the Super League war in the 90s. So there's already been teams playing in these locations. And in Perth, the only reason why the team failed was it ran out of money. It wasn't due to not having a good team. It just didn't make much money. Adelaide, it was just a mess because of poor governance. But the willingness is there. So I just don't know. I mean, it's an interesting one, but the RFL doesn't have the money. It needs to grow the game domestically first. That's my personal opinion. Same with the French side of things. They need to grow the game a bit more domestically outside of, again, the southwest, because other regions of France have bought into rugby union, especially in the northeast. Around Paris, they have bought in the last 20, 30 years. So it's not inconceivable that you could grow the game across the channel. You could grow the game in the south of England, but it's up to the governing bodies to show willingness and a drive to do so. And if the RFL is going to the government going, yeah, we need some money, please. We've run out of cash. Can you give us an emergency loan so we can survive until we can restart? tells you something. And I think some of the players who've now played in the NRL and are listening to the fact they want to grow the game out there. Like James Graham, if they were interviewing James Graham or Sam Burgess, so other ex players. Well, James Graham's still playing, but this is his last season. He's finishing off at St Helens. If you were to interview them and say, would you like to see the game grow in the south of England and the north of France? They would probably say yes. It would be beneficial for the sport going forward, increase the player base, increase the fan base, and increase the media attention and the money coming in. That's what they have to do. The Toronto experiment has proved that that's a step too far at this time, because the best way to have a Toronto team is in a domestic Canadian-US competition. Look at Major League Rugby. There's a reason why Major League Rugby works really well, is they've decided to grow the game domestically and get as many domestically based players playing the sport, and then bring in a couple of superstars who are near the end of their careers, who still want to play, still believe they can play and contribute, but they've decided we've got some grassroots already here. We have some green shoots. Let's build on that. And unfortunately, COVID shut the league down, but it's still a going concern. And they've got an education pathway through the colleges and universities to build upon. And there is some corporate interest and there's some TV deals out there. So Major League Rugby shows what you can do, growing a sport from semi-pro, amateur levels to professional. And it is doable. But it does take a bit of hard work and a bit of planning. I don't think the way the Wolfpack was set up is going to work long term. But yeah, it is surprising that the Catalan and Toulouse are working really well in the southwest of France, but that is in the French rugby league country and rugby union country. It's in the traditional location. Flip side of that, they tried with PSG in Paris in the 90s and it didn't work. So, but again, it's down to the governing body. It is down to the governing body having the willingness and getting a better, and they need to get a better TV deal. They need to grow the audience. They need to grow the interest in the sport, and they are going to expand in the non-traditional locations in the home countries, in England and France. They need to get the corporate money on side and need to get a better TV deal and grow the game and get a wider audience. And don't get me wrong, there are fans of rugby league outside the north of England and the southwest of France. We exist. The RFL doesn't think we do. We're not meant to, according to the RFL, but we exist. And there is a big Australian and New Zealand expat community in the southeast of England. There's loads of Aussies and Kiwis around here. There's loads in the south of England, loads of them. And don't get me wrong, they like the rugby league, they like their AFL, they exist, which will then help local communities when you set up grassroots clubs. But you could look at rugby union. It's winning the battle of hearts and minds up north. It's got more schools playing rugby union than rugby league. It's got more clubs, amateur, semi-pro and pro playing. Rugby union's won the battle of the split. And rugby union's got its own financial problems and issues with the sport and needs to come up with some ways to speed up the flow of the game and make the game a little bit more entertaining, because it's getting a little bit of an arm wrestle, which I don't think all fans want to buy into, so to speak. But oh my God, my mustache is annoying me. I've got a ball patch there. I have a ball patch there. It's really annoying. But no, I think this again comes back to my theme of governance. It does come back to my theme of governance, back to the UCB, back to the theme of governance and why we are having these continual issues with sports governance. Why these issues aren't going away, why they keep being raised as conversation starters. And it's just like YouTubers like me, it's across the board. The issue of governance comes up a lot on social media with fans feeling a disconnect. And I haven't even got onto the Mason Greenwood and Phil Foden with their little lockdown breach in Iceland with smuggling a couple of ladies back to the hotel. That again comes down to a lack of discipline and individual players, and these guys are meant to be role models. And what we've seen, I'm going to go on to that, is clearly there's an attitude that's pervasive in a lot of sports of entitlement. And you look at some of the antics of some of these players during lockdown, and people were defending them when tens of thousands of people are dying. people were defending these people for their lockdown breaches. And because these predominantly young men are role models for teenagers and kids, you wonder why the rate of infection amongst young people is dangerously high right now, and why there are concerns. And what Foden and Greenwood have done is shown a lack of respect to the coach Gareth Southgate. But Gareth Southgate doesn't strike me as a guy who's authoritarian. But it does show a lack of respect for the jersey you wear and the coach and systems in place. And questions have to be asked about, okay, will there have to be the curfew brought in? Will you have to treat these adults like kids? And a lot of them are not much older than kids. You know, the fact that Kyle Walker was in the squad with his lockdown breaches and his misbehaviour really is a head scratcher when you've left Jack Grealish out, who's a far more creative player and is a club captain who plays regularly for his club. Walker barely gets to the Man City side. You have to look at the composition of but then football players seem to be doing this a lot in the last 7 months. The misbehaviour of so many players, regardless of their level in the game, making headlines. And it fuels the reputation and the stereotype that football players are yobs. They're overpaid, they're entitled, they're pretentious, and they're out of touch. And unfortunately, that is coming across. So what happens going forward with the next England squad, whether Greenwood and Foden, doesn't matter how well they play, will they get selected? Because I think Grealish missed out because of some of his indiscretions off the field over the last couple of seasons. And he misbehaved during lockdown, and I think that cost him. But Kyle Walker misbehaved on lockdown. But the lack of experienced players in that squad, I don't think Southgate had much of a choice but to select a couple of senior heads. And unfortunately, Kyle Walker, who I don't rate as a player at the top level, and that's easy for me to say as a fan of sport on the outside in, he's not a good player. He's not a good role model. He's not a good leader. You look at his slimy antics during lockdown. It's not a good look. And the negative headlines, and then you get negative press headlines, and that will then follow the squad around, and that will affect performances. We've seen it before in many a tournament, many a Euros, many a World Cup, where an individual player or players have got some negative headlines following around. There's allegations of them misbehaving, and then the team underperforms. So I think Southgate can be questioned about some of his selections, some of his tactics, and that came up, on various live streams about Southgate's squad selection and who he took. And then players misbehave. And that in itself shows he has a lack of authority with that playing group. And unfortunately, a lot of that playing group aren't very old. They're teenagers. A lot of them are under the age of 25. I did not watch any of the NFL. I think it'll be interesting to see if the NFL season does get complete. And it'll be interesting to see how many players test positive during the season and what the NFL does. If a player or players test positive in large numbers, it'll be interesting to see if the NFL season gets completed, and it'll be interesting to see what happens when it comes to the NFL if players start testing positive in large numbers. Because we've already seen it in the MLS, teams pull out of that MLS competition that was in Orlando, Florida. We've seen it in Major League Baseball, a whole host of players testing positive that upset the schedule a little bit. We've seen it in the NBA, players leaving the bubble. We've seen it in the NHL, players leaving the bubble going, no, I'm going back for family reasons. I'm not staying on in the team. We've seen it in the NRL. Players, especially the Warriors, have gone, no, I'm going home to see my family. I'm not staying away from my family for 6 to 9 months. It's just not happening. So it'll be interesting to see what happens when players start testing positive in numbers. I might watch the Super Bowl in February, but I don't know. There's a lot to happen between the next 5, 6 months. But it'll be interesting to see how the NFL reacts to players testing positive. And if it starts happening in larger and larger numbers, we look at college football. Look at the CFL not even having a season. That tells you something. When the CFL decided we're not going to have a season this year, that tells you the state of play. And looking at the Canadian situation, they could have had a season. But without fans in attendance, it makes that a loss maker for all 9 teams. So the CFL's future is in doubt long term, and the NFL, only one stadium allowed fans in, and that was Jacksonville. So we've already, I think, covered this at the beginning of the live stream, but I didn't watch any. But it'll be interesting to see what happens with this season and if and when players test positive, because then that creates a different kettle of fish. That then creates its own headaches um, for the competition and for the league, because obviously they're not gone in with the bubble like the NHL did with the playoffs and the resumption of play. The NHL went with the bubble in Edmonton and the bubble in Toronto. Major League Soccer went with the bubble in Orlando. The NBA went with bubble cities as well. The Major League Baseball were thinking about a bubble in Arizona and Florida. Then they decided to go with home stadiums, and that was to do with the media rights. Drove that one rather than any kind of planning. Major League Rugby, I don't think has resumed yet. I think they're still we're not playing until next season. We're calling this a write-off. NASCAR limited fans in attendance, depends on the location, but they've resumed and readjusted their season. And motorsport, I think it's easier to get a season up and running. We've seen that with the touring cars. We've seen that with F1, MotoGP, Superbikes, because you can keep the riders and the drivers separate from fans. But again, with the NFL, it's going to be interesting to see what happens when players start testing positive, because they will. Because a lot of these players like to misbehave off the field. We've seen it in the training camps, players trying to smuggle women into hotel rooms and into the training camp bubble. So we shall have to wait and see what happens when positive tests start coming in. And it will happen. It will happen. So on the NFL, it's a wait and see. I might catch the odd game, but NFL really isn't my cup of tea necessarily. But it doesn't mean I won't catch the odd game this season, but I'm more waiting to see what happens with any positive test results and player misbehaviour, because that's probably more interesting than Brady going to the Buccaneers. But North American sport is at a crossroads, and Major League Baseball, I'm surprised, still hasn't come up with a salary cap, considering that all that struggle to get the season restarted and then players testing positive all over the place. So again, North American sports governance needs a massive overhaul. Massive overhaul. But no, people ask, a lot of viewers have asked me, like, did I watch any of the NFL? No, I was busy. I was actually watching the NRL and the Tour de France over the weekend, and you've got fans in attendance, so there's actually a natural atmosphere rather than the fake crowd noise, which a lot of people have complained about. A lot of people, depending on the sport, have complained about the pumped-in fake crowd noise, and I don't like it either. I'm not a fan of it, but it's there. It's what the broadcasters have decided to do as part of their package. That's what's been negotiated between the broadcasters and the league. They've signed off on it. The canned crowd noise, we know certain teams do it anyway, even with fans in attendance, to make it seem like there's more people there than there actually is. It's a known thing. Canned crowd noise, a lot of people haven't been overly enthusiastic about that. That's something that hasn't gone down well. I didn't enjoy it watching the Champions League and Europa League finals. I will admit that. I didn't have an option to turn it off because I watched on the BT YouTube channel. But if you watch on the TV, you have the option to turn it off. Some people just don't bother. They just go, sod it, I'm just going to leave it as is. But yeah, there is a lot of people complaining that they just pressed the mute button. They just couldn't be bothered to go through the TV program and go quiet effort. So a lot of them just hit mute and just watch the game without commentary with the sound off, which gives a false representation of the figures. But no, the fake crowd and the canned crowd noise is something that a lot of people aren't a fan of, and that is an ongoing, concern with that. But no, I didn't watch any American football. I think I'm starting to fall out of love with a lot of sports. And for a sports channel, that's really weird for me to say, but I've fallen out of love with a lot of sports as time has gone on. And there are certain sports that I follow more religiously than others. I've given the NHL a bit of a break because it's normally this time of year that it's pre-season, so I'm not really as actively, you know, invested in the NHL this year. I was until about February, and then I started to lose a little bit of interest in the current season with how things were going with the teams that I follow. Both of them made the play-in round, and one made the actual playoffs. One fell out the play-in round, but now that the two teams that I follow in the NHL aren't contesting any part of the Stanley Cup, there's no interest there for me. Major League Rugby I was getting into. I was really enjoying that, and the lockdown happened, which is really frustrating because the quality of rugby union in Major League Rugby is improving. It's a good level of professionalism. It's obviously not at the same level of the English Premiership or the French top 14, or the Pro League, but it's a good quality to watch, and it's fun to watch because it's actually quite open. There's a lot of mistakes. It's a very open style of rugby union, and it'll be nice to see Major League Rugby return. You know, it's a fun product. They've obviously, it's a fun product to watch. The annoying thing is they have the water breaks after 20 minutes. So I think fitness is a concern when it comes to their overall fitness as players. But I enjoy watching it. That's kind of fun. And some of the rugby can be quite expansive, and there's some very good players coming through. So I think the future of US and Canadian rugby union is looking a lot brighter than it could have been. I think that's a good, solid basis. And they are nicking American football players. They are converting Canadian and American football players over to rugby union. And I think the NFL especially is looking at rugby union and taking it seriously, and rugby league. You look at the Jared Hayne and Valentine Holmes experiments, and Malatia, I think his name is. He's played for the Rabbitohs. He's gone over. Philadelphia Eagles drafted him a couple of years ago. I'm starting to look at it, and that says to me that the NFL is worried about both codes of rugby. It's taking it kind of seriously because we've had Jared Hayne play for the 49ers, and we've had Valentine Holmes, we've had Christian Wade, Buffalo Bills. So they are starting to take other sports seriously when it comes to the athletic ability of league and union players in rugby. The International Player Pathway Program. Okay, we could argue how successful that's been. Is that just a PR stunt, or is there actually a general appetite to convert rugby union, rugby league players over to American football? Because I do think the NFL especially is getting wary of the rise of both codes of rugby in North America, especially rugby union. They're very, very wary of it, and that we have seen American football players switch codes and go over to rugby union. We've seen rugby league players dip their toe in when it comes to the NFL. I think the NFL is taking the threat of both codes of rugby quite seriously. You can see I think that's one of the reasons why they put this international player pathway in place, is to try and poach rugby players rather than have NFL players poached and college football players poached by union and league. I think that's something that to consider. Whether it ends up being a successful program long term is something that we'll have to see down the line when we get to it. But no, gone off on a tangent now. I'm now talking about the International Player Pathway Program. Didn't think I'd talk about that today, considering some of the sports stories that are happening with the Championship playing football matches tonight. Second round of games. But yeah, interesting one. Right, any more questions from anyone? Because I'm going to start calling the streamer a day, I think, because I've got to do my dinner. I've got to get my dinner sorted out. I've got to go shopping. So, any further questions to add to the live stream? Because I'm going to start winding it down in the next 5-10 minutes. It'll be interesting to see if anyone else has got any other questions to put to me. But we have covered a lot this evening. Sports governance has been a massive topic tonight. TV deals has been a massive topic. And yeah, we've ended up talking about a lot about. We did a big conversations about the Bradford Bulls. But yeah, no, it's an interesting one where we've ended up. We started with the ECB and their financial woes and cutting staff. And we've ended up talking about the NFL and International Player Pathway. Interesting one. I think where I can sum it up is the ECB. while I'm waiting for questions, the ECB, where they went wrong was in 2005. Plain and simple, when they signed that monopoly of a TV deal with Sky, that's where the mistakes were made. And the mainstream media that wasn't Murdoch owned really kicked off about that. I do remember the day that the team went to Downing Street to meet the Prime Minister, and it was all over the news, was the day that the ECB signed the deal. And a large portion of the media that wasn't Murdoch owned really hit out. And this is before Twitter, this is before Facebook. MySpace was in its infancy, so social media was in its infancy at this point. But the reaction publicly, and what I remember, was very negative towards the Sky deal then. As time has gone on, you look at social media, and when they came up with the 100 format, the reaction was, just give us our free-to-air cricket back. So I don't know whoever came up with the 100 format really has done his market research on what fans want. But the ECB have realised less fans are going to games. This is before COVID. And they are losing viewership figures. When they look at the Nielsen ratings about how many people are viewing compared to other TV at the time when it comes to sports, comparable sports that are broadcast at the same time, be it on subscription or free to air, and their viewership is stagnating and going down and is not at the levels it was 2005. Interesting to note the Cricket World Cup final obviously being free to air TV, highest TV rating they've had in 14 years at that point. And they were like, oh, look, it's a success. No, it's only because it's on free to air TV. Had England not made that final, we don't get any free to air cricket during the Cricket World Cup. And fans were critical of the highlights package. Fans were critical of only one free to air game in the Cricket World Cup. A host World Cup, we're the host nation. Rugby league, it's on free to air TV. Rugby union, free to air TV. Football, free to air TV. The World Championship ice hockey, free sports, free to air TV. So, and we're not even a host nation in that, but we're competing in that. So already there was a reaction from fans saying, this is what we want. We don't want the 100, we want this. So their lack of communication with the fan base and their lack of trust with the fan base and the poor relationship that the ECB has been building for 15 years. They've really misread the room. And questions have to be asked about, okay, they've got all this TV money. Where has the money gone? Where has the money gone? You have to ask that question about where the money's gone. And that is a long-term issue because they've earned so much money off the Sky TV deal. Where's it all gone? They flogged the Ashes series to death with the Australians, and Cricket Australia's got its own problems, governance, money, sponsorship, TV deals as well. It's not just the ECB, Cricket Australia's in a mess as well, as is Rugby Australia. So the governing bodies of some of the biggest sports in the world have got problems. But questions have to be asked about an organisation which has had this TV deal must be worth at least £1 billion over the last 15 years, if not more. Where's all that money gone? They're reporting losses of £100 million in just 7 months. They are still not got a plan B for the 100 format, so they're putting money down a black hole because it's going to make a loss in the first year, possibly break even in the second. If the first year's a flop, the second year is going to be a disaster. So they're already risking a lot of financial capital on a tournament that people don't want, which can't take place this year. They're laying off staff at their head office. So the ECB is in a right mess. And where it goes from here in the future, anyone's guess. The fact that they've admitted they're losing money, they're laying off staff. I think other sports organisations are going to be going down the same route. I mean, the RFU, I think, have already laid off staff. The RFL, Rugby League, have had to get a government loan. You go over to Australia, the NRL has got more staff in their head office. I think it's 160 staff for an organisation that only has 16 teams. And the revenue difference between the English Premier League and the NRL is huge. They have more staff than the Premier League head office. So even sports that are actually making money and being reasonably successful, restructuring. So we are going to see a lot more governing bodies have to trim costs at head office. The fact that 1/5 of the budget of the ECB's office functions is being slashed, which basically means 62 jobs have got to go. tells you that there's a clear imbalance in that organisation, and questions have to be asked about how the organisation's run. Other organisations, like the Football League, like the FA, like the Premier League, are going to have to go down the same road. No fans in attendance, big clubs like Man United losing money. So sport is going to have to adjust itself financially. But there we go. So I'm going to call that a day. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for all your questions. Got more videos obviously coming soon. Keep your eyes peeled, and thank you very much for watching. Goodbye for now.